Sunday dinners in the 1960s meant something sacred in black households across America. The kitchen was not merely where food was prepared. It was where history lived, where recipes passed down through generations transformed simple ingredients into cultural treasures, and where families gathered to share more than just meals. The dishes that graced those tables told stories of survival, creativity, and profound love. But walk into most kitchens today, and you will notice something missing. Many of those beloved soul food dishes have quietly disappeared, taking with them techniques, flavors, and traditions that once defined black culinary heritage. What happened to those recipes that grandmothers guarded like precious jewels? Here are 25 soul food dishes from the 1960s that have largely vanished from our tables, each one a testament to a time when food was both sustenance and cultural expression. 1. Hand-pressed lard biscuits. In the 1960s, biscuits made with hand-rendered lard were a Sunday morning ritual in black households. Grandmothers would wake before dawn, their hands working cold lard into flour with a practiced touch that could not be replicated by any modern appliance. The result was biscuits with layers so flaky they would practically dissolve on the tongue, with a richness that butter alone could never achieve. Children would gather in the kitchen, drawn by the smell of these golden treasures emerging from the oven, their tops brushed with melted butter until they glistened. These biscuits were not just breakfast, they were edible history. The lard itself was often rendered from hogs that families raised or purchased from local farmers, a process that took hours of patient stirring and straining. Women would gather fat scraps, render them down slowly, and store the pure, white lard in ceramic rocks. This self-sufficiency was born from necessity, but became a source of pride. Each family's lard biscuits tasted slightly different, carrying the signature of their maker's hands and technique. Today, health concerns and the convenience of store-bought alternatives have nearly eliminated this practice. Few people know how to properly render lard, and even fewer possess the muscle memory required to work it into dough with the perfect touch. The art of hand-pressed lard biscuits has become a casualty of modernization, taking with it a texture and flavor that defined countless childhood mornings. 2. Proper chitlin strut preparations. The annual chitlin strut was more than just cleaning and cooking hog intestines. It was a community event that brought neighborhoods together every winter. Families would gather in garages or back porches, spending hours cleaning chitlins with meticulous care, a process that required patience, strong stomachs, and experienced hands. The women who knew how to prepare them properly were respected for their skill, turning what many considered waste into a delicacy that would simmer for hours with onions, potatoes, and secret spice blends that varied from household to household. The cooking process itself was an all-day affair. The smell would permeate entire neighborhoods, a pungent aroma that some loved and others tolerated, but everyone recognized. Kids would be sent outside to play while adults worked, and when the chitlins were finally ready, tender, flavorful, and served with hot sauce and vinegar, the feast would begin. It was not just about the food. It was about transforming humble ingredients into something celebrated, a culinary tradition rooted in making do with what was available during slavery and sharecropping. The younger generations have largely abandoned this tradition. The intensive labor, the distinctive smell, and changing tastes have made properly prepared chitlins increasingly rare. The few restaurants that still serve them often cannot replicate the care and technique that home cooks once employed. An entire methodology of preparation, passed through demonstration rather than written recipes, has nearly vanished. 3. Sawmill gravy over salt pork. Sawmill gravy in the 1960s was not the tame white gravy found in restaurants today. It was a robust, deeply flavored creation made from salt pork drippings, flour, and milk, cooked until it reached a consistency thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. The salt pork itself, thick slabs of preserved pork belly, would be fried until crispy, its fat rendering into the pan to form the foundation of the gravy. This breakfast staple sustained families through long workdays, providing protein and calories when both were precious commodities. The technique required knowledge that came from experience. The roux had to be cooked to exactly the right color. Too pale, and it tasted raw. Too dark, and it became bitter. The milk had to be added gradually, whisked constantly to prevent lumps, and seasoned boldly with black pepper that would make your eyes water. Served over biscuits or alongside eggs. This gravy was hearty enough to fuel a day of manual labor. Fathers would eat it before heading to factory jobs, children before walking to school in cold weather. Salt pork has disappeared from most grocery stores, replaced by bacon and other cured meats. The gravy itself has been lightened, sweetened, and sanitized for broader appeal. What was once a powerhouse breakfast born from necessity has become a watered-down version of its former self, missing the intensity and substance that made it a staple of black working-class kitchens. For cracklin cornbread. Cracklin cornbread was a revelation in texture and flavor that modern cornbread cannot approach. The cracklings, crispy rendered pieces of pork skin and fat, were folded into cornmeal batter, creating pockets of intense, savory richness throughout each slice. When baked in a cast-iron skillet that had been heated until smoking, the edges would develop a dark, crunchy crust while the interior remained tender and studded with those precious bits of crackling. The contrast between the sweet corn flavor and the salty, fatty cracklings created a complexity that elevated cornbread from side dish to centerpiece. Making cracklings was an art form itself. After rendering lard, the remaining skin and fat pieces would be fried slowly until they reached that perfect point between chewy and crispy. Some cooks preferred them almost chip-like. Others left them with more bite. These would be stored in mason jars, ready to be incorporated into cornbread, beans, or greens. The smell of cracklin cornbread baking would announce itself throughout a house, promising comfort and satisfaction. The decline of home pork processing and the move away from high-fat foods has made cracklin cornbread extraordinarily rare. The few places that still make it often use commercial pork rinds, which lack the freshness and quality of home-rendered cracklings. An entire dimension of cornbread, that interplay of textures and the deep porky richness, has been lost to time and changing dietary trends. 5. Neck bone and butterbean stew. Pork neck bones simmered with butter beans created a stew that was pure soul food alchemy. The neck bones, rich with meat clinging to complex bones and thick with collagen, would cook for hours until they released their essence into a broth that turned silky and deeply flavorful. The butter beans, those large, creamy legumes, would absorb this richness while contributing their own subtle, earthy sweetness. This was not a quick meal. It required patience and understanding of how time transforms humble ingredients into something greater than the sum of their parts. The process began with browning the neck bones to develop flavor, then adding onions, garlic, and sometimes a ham hock for additional depth. Water or stock would be added, and the pot would simmer gently for hours, the meat gradually becoming so tender it would fall from the bones with the gentlest touch. The butter beans would go in during the final hour, timing calculated, so they would be creamy but not mushy. Some cooks added tomatoes, others kept it simple, but everyone knew the secret was in the slow cooking and proper seasoning. This dish has faded because neck bones have become difficult to find in many areas, and the time required does not fit modern lifestyles. Fast food and quick meals have replaced the slow, meditative cooking that dishes like this demanded. The knowledge of how to coax maximum flavor from these bony cuts, how to time everything perfectly, and how to season boldly but not overwhelm has become rare, known only to those who learned it before convenience became king. 6. Liver pudding, liver mush. Liver pudding was a breakfast meat that divided families. Children often despised it, while adults savored its rich, mineral intensity. Made from pork liver, cornmeal, and spices ground together into a loaf, then sliced and fried until crispy edged, it provided a protein-dense start to the day that cost pennies to produce. The texture was unique, somehow both smooth and coarse, and when fried properly, the outside would develop a crust that contrasted beautifully with the creamy interior. Served with eggs and grits, it was a breakfast that sustained manual laborers through demanding physical work. The preparation of liver pudding was traditionally done in large batches. After hog killing time, when families would process an entire pig, nothing went to waste. The liver would be cooked, ground with pork scraps and fatback, mixed with cornmeal and seasoning, then packed into loaf pans and either canned or frozen. Each family had their own spice blend. Some preferred sage-heavy. Others added more black and red pepper. The result was a preserved meat that could be sliced and fried throughout the winter months. Liver pudding has virtually disappeared outside of specific regional pockets in the rural South. Modern sensibilities have turned against organ meats, and the labor-intensive process of making it from scratch has been abandoned. Commercial versions exist, but lack the depth and care of homemade batches. The tradition of using every part of the animal, of transforming organ meat into something breakfast-worthy, has been lost along with the knowledge of how to make properly. 7. Hog maw stuffed with sausage. Hog maw, the stomach of a pig stuffed with sausage, potatoes, and seasonings, was a centerpiece dish for special occasions in the 1960s. The stomach would be cleaned meticulously, turned inside out and scrubbed until pristine, then stuffed with a mixture of ground pork or sausage, diced potatoes, onions, and peppers. Sewn shut and roasted slowly until the maw became tender and the filling steamed inside its natural casing. It emerged from the oven as a self-contained feast, sliced thick at the table. Each portion included the tender, slightly chewy stomach along with the savory filling. The preparation required skills that were passed directly from one generation to the next. Cleaning the hog maw properly was crucial. Any remnants would ruin the dish. The stuffing needed to be seasoned boldly because the stomach itself was mild. Some families would parboil the maw first. Others roasted it from raw. Timing calculated through experience rather than thermometers. The finished dish was impressive, turning an organ that many would discard into something that graced holiday tables and Sunday dinners. Hog maw has become nearly impossible to find in conventional grocery stores, and even ethnic markets rarely carry it. The younger generation, with different tastes and less willingness to work with organ meats, has let this tradition fade. The technique of proper cleaning, stuffing, and cooking has become arcane knowledge. What was once a beloved special occasion dish has become a distant memory, discussed nostalgically but rarely recreated. 8. Pot liquor and cornbread dunking ritual. Pot liquor, the flavorful broth left after cooking collard greens, turnip greens, or mustard greens, was never discarded in the 1960s. Instead, it was saved, heated, and served in bowls with crumbled cornbread, creating a dish that was simultaneously soup, bread, and vegetable. The liquor itself was rich with nutrients that had leached from the greens, smoky from the ham hock or fatback used in cooking, and seasoned to perfection with the greens' cooking liquid. Children would crumble their cornbread into bowls of this steaming broth, the bread absorbing the liquid while retaining some texture. The ritual of pot liquor consumption was about practicality and respect for food. Nothing was wasted, especially not the nutrient-dense liquid that represented hours of cooking. Some families would save it to cook their next batch of greens, building layers of flavor. Others would drink it straight from mugs, considering it both nourishing and medicinal. The combination of pot liquor and cornbread was comfort food in its purest form, simple, satisfying, and deeply connected to agricultural roots and times when every calorie mattered. Today, pot liquor is often poured down the drain or forgotten. The practice of saving and consuming it has largely disappeared, along with the understanding of its nutritional value. The ritual of crumbling cornbread into the hot liquid, of savoring that simple combination, has faded as eating habits have become more varied and less tied to necessity. A tradition that represented both frugality and wisdom has been lost to a generation that never learned to value every component of a meal. 10. Blackberry dumplings. Blackberry dumplings were summer's sweet gift, made when berries grew wild along roadsides and fence lines. The dish was deceptively simple: a pot of sweetened, simmering blackberries into which spoonfuls of drop dumpling batter were gently placed. As the dumplings cooked, they would steam and expand, their bottoms absorbing berry juice while their tops remained fluffy. The result was a dessert that was part fruit, part pastry, served warm in bowls with the purple-black syrup pooling around tender dumplings that burst with berry flavor when bitten. Making blackberry dumplings was a communal activity. Children would be sent out with buckets to pick berries, returning with stained fingers and full containers. The berries would be sorted, washed, and cooked down with sugar until they released their juice. The dumpling batter required a light touch. Overmixing would make them tough. They had to be dropped carefully into the simmering fruit, spaced so they would not stick together. And the pot had to maintain a gentle bubble without boiling vigorously. Timing was learned through practice, and each cook developed their own sense of when the dumplings were perfectly done. This dessert has faded as wild blackberry picking has become rare. Modern berries from grocery stores lack the intense flavor of wild fruit, and the patience required to make dumplings from scratch competes poorly with ready-made desserts. The tradition of seasonal cooking, making specific dishes when specific ingredients were naturally available, has been replaced by year-round access to everything. The skills needed to make perfect dumplings, neither gummy nor tough, have not been passed on, leaving blackberry dumplings as a sweet memory that few can recreate. 11. Head cheese with hot pepper vinegar. Head cheese was not cheese at all, but tranche made from the entire head of a hog, slow simmered until every bit of meat, skin, and collagen could be picked from the bones. The resulting mixture, finely chopped meat suspended in its own natural gelatin, would be seasoned with garlic, onions, and spices, then packed into loaf pans and chilled until solid. Sliced thin and served cold with crackers or bread, head cheese was often accompanied by hot pepper vinegar, the acid cutting through the rich, fatty meat while the peppers added fire. It was a test of a cook's skill and an expression of nose-to-tail eating before that phrase became fashionable. The preparation of head cheese was labor-intensive and not for the squeamish. The hog's head would be cleaned, singed to remove hair, and simmered for hours until everything became tender. The process would fill the house with a distinctive smell that announced what was being made. Once cooled enough to handle, the cook would pick through the head, separating meat from bone with practiced fingers, discarding cartilage but keeping the tender bits from ears, snout, and cheeks. The natural gelatin from the prolonged cooking would bind everything together when chilled, creating sliceable portions that showcased the variety of textures. Head cheese has become nearly extinct, regarded as too extreme even by those who love traditional soul food. The labor involved, combined with modern sensibilities about eating every part of an animal's head, has pushed it to the margins. The few who still make it are usually elderly, carrying forward a tradition that younger family members find interesting but do not intend to continue. The knowledge of proper preparation, how long to cook, how to season, how to achieve the right texture, is dying with them. 12. Homemade scrapple. Scrapple was the ultimate expression of using every bit of the hog. Ground pork scraps, organ meats, and cornmeal would be cooked together into a thick porridge-like mixture, seasoned with sage, black pepper, and other spices, then poured into loaf pans to set. Once firm, it would be sliced and fried until the outside was crispy and dark while the interior remained soft and flavorful. Served at breakfast with eggs and grits, scrapple provided protein and substance from parts of the pig that might otherwise be wasted. It was frugality transformed into deliciousness. The making of scrapple was typically done during hog killing time, when families would process an entire animal. After the choice cuts were taken, hams, shoulders, bacon. What remained would be ground and cooked down with cornmeal and stock until it reached the consistency of thick grits. The seasoning was crucial. It needed to be bold enough to stand up to the strong flavors of mixed meats. The mixture would be poured into whatever containers were available, then stored in the refrigerator or cold cellar to be sliced and fried as needed throughout the winter. Scrapple has faded from black households, though it remains popular in some mid-Atlantic regions. The homemaking of it has nearly ceased because few families process their own hogs anymore, and the willingness to work with meat scraps and organs has diminished. Commercial scrapple exists, but cannot replicate the flavor complexity and personal touch of homemade batches. The tradition of turning the least desirable parts of an animal into a breakfast staple has been lost, along with the recipes that made each family's scrapple unique. 13. Hoe cakes cooked on a flat shovel. Hoe cakes earned their name from the original method of preparation. Cornmeal batter cooked on the flat blade of a hoe held over an open fire. By the 1960s, most were made on cast iron griddles or skillets, but the name and the method persisted. These were not the thick cornmeal pancakes found in restaurants today, but thin, crispy cakes with lacy golden brown edges, cooked in generous amounts of fat until they developed a crust that shattered when bitten. They were served hot, often alongside greens and beans, used to sop up pot liquor, or just eaten with a drizzle of cane syrup. The batter for hoe cakes was simple: cornmeal, water, or buttermilk, a touch of salt. But the technique separated adequate cooks from masters. The griddle had to be screaming hot, the fat barely beginning to smoke. The batter had to be thin enough to spread slightly when poured, but thick enough to hold together. The timing was intuitive, learned through repetition. Flip when the edges curled and bubbles appeared on the surface. Cook the second side until golden. Some cooks added an egg to bind the batter. Others kept it pure cornmeal. But everyone understood that the ratio of crust to interior was what made hoe cake special. True hoe cakes have been replaced by thicker, fluffier cornmeal pancakes that share the name but not the essence. The technique of making them paper-thin and crispy has been lost, along with the understanding that they were meant to be a vehicle for other foods rather than a main attraction. The skill of maintaining the perfect griddle temperature, of knowing by sight when to flip, of achieving that ideal texture has become rare. What was once a daily staple has become a novelty. Its authentic preparation known only to a dwindling number of elders. 14. Pickled pig feet, seasoned at home. Pickled pig feet were bar food and home snack food throughout black communities in the 1960s. Unlike the commercial versions found in jars at gas stations today, home pickled pig feet were a craft. The feet would be cleaned meticulously, simmered until tender, then placed in a brine of vinegar, water, sugar, and spices, each family having their own blend. Some preferred sweet and tangy. Others made theirs fiery with hot peppers. The feet would cure in this brine for days, absorbing flavors while the collagen-rich skin became pleasantly gelatinous. Eaten cold, they were a unique treat, their texture and taste unlike anything else. The preparation began with intensive cleaning. Pig feet needed to be scalded, scraped, and sometimes singed to remove any hair. They would be simmered for hours until the meat was tender and could be easily pulled from the bones. While still warm, they would be packed into jars with onions, peppers, bay leaves, peppercorns, and whatever other aromatics the cook favored. The brine would be boiled and poured over. Then the jars would be sealed and left to cure. The longer they sat, the better they became, the flavors melding and intensifying. Home pickling of pig feet has virtually disappeared. The labor involved is considerable in the commercial versions. Inferior though they may be, are readily available. The knowledge of proper cleaning techniques, ideal spice combinations, and curing times has not been passed down. What was once a way to preserve meat and create a distinctive snack has become another lost tradition. Its authentic taste known only to those old enough to remember when their grandmothers kept jars of pig feet in the refrigerator. 15. Fatback and molasses over biscuits. Fatback fried crispy and served over biscuits with cane molasses drizzled on top was a breakfast that combined salty, sweet, and rich in perfect harmony. The fatback, thick slabs of pork back fat with little to no meat, would be sliced thin and fried until the edges were brown and crispy, the center still slightly chewy. The rendered fat would be saved for other cooking, while the crispy slices would be placed on split biscuits. Molasses would be drizzled over everything, its dark, complex sweetness cutting through the pork's richness. This breakfast sustained field workers and factory laborers, providing calories and satisfaction from inexpensive ingredients. The quality of the ingredients mattered immensely. Good fatback had to be properly cured, not too salty, with the right ratio of fat to lean. The molasses needed to be real cane molasses, not corn syrup. Its mineral complexity and slight bitterness balanced the dish. The biscuits had to be fresh, preferably still warm, substantial enough to support the toppings without dissolving. When all three components came together properly, the combination was greater than its parts, sweet and savory playing off each other in a way that satisfied deeply. This breakfast has vanished from most tables, victim of changing nutritional understanding and taste preferences. Fatback is difficult to find in many areas, and the idea of eating pure pork fat with molasses seems excessive to modern sensibilities. The practice of combining these specific ingredients, of understanding how the sweetness of molasses transforms fried pork fat into something more interesting, has been forgotten. What was once a common and beloved breakfast has become an anachronism, its memory fading with each passing year. 16. Oxtail stew with root vegetables. Oxtail stew in the 1960s was different from the trendy restaurant dish it has become. Then oxtails were inexpensive, considered a throwaway cut that required knowledge and patience to transform into something tender and deeply flavorful. The tails would be browned deeply, developing fond on the bottom of the pot, then simmered for hours with root vegetables, turnips, rutabagas, carrots, until the meat fell from the bones and the broth became rich and gelatinous. This was not quick cooking. It was an investment of time that returned dividends in flavor and satisfaction. The technique involved understanding heat and timing. The oxtails needed to brown properly without burning, which meant a hot pot and careful attention. Once liquid was added, the temperature had to be reduced to a bare simmer. Boiling would make the meat tough. The vegetables would be added in stages, the longest cooking ones first. Timing calculated so everything would finish tender at the same time. Some cooks added tomatoes. Others kept it simple with just onions and root vegetables. Everyone understood that the stew was not ready until the meat released from the bone with the gentlest pressure. Oxtails are no longer inexpensive, having been discovered by fine dining and priced accordingly. The home cooking of them has declined as their cost has risen, and as the patience required for proper preparation has competed with faster meal options. The knowledge of how to coax maximum flavor from oxtails, how to time the cooking perfectly, how to achieve that silky collagen-rich broth, is becoming rare. What was once a humble pot of stew has become either a restaurant luxury or a forgotten dish, its authentic preparation known to fewer people each year. 17. Fried corn straight from the cob. Fried corn was not corn kernels fried in a pan, but fresh corn cut from the cob and cooked in bacon grease or butter until caramelized and intensely sweet. The process began with shucking fresh corn, then carefully cutting the kernels from the cob with a sharp knife, scraping afterward to release the milky liquid that remained. This mixture of kernels and milk would be cooked in a cast iron skillet with pork fat, stirring frequently as it transformed from starchy and raw to golden and creamy. The corn's natural sugars would caramelize, edges would brown slightly, and the result was a side dish that was simultaneously sweet, savory, and utterly addictive. The technique required fresh corn, not frozen, not canned, but corn that had been picked that day or the day before. The sweetness was paramount, and corn that was too old would be starchy rather than sugary. The cutting method mattered too. The kernels needed to be removed cleanly, but the cob had to be scraped to release that milky liquid which would make the finished dish creamy. The cooking was straightforward but needed attention. The corn could burn quickly once it began to caramelize, and constant stirring prevented sticking while promoting even browning. Fresh fried corn has become rare as access to truly fresh corn has declined. Most people buy corn from supermarkets where it may be days old, having lost the intense sweetness that made fried corn special. The practice of cutting corn from the cob rather than buying frozen has faded, and with it, the understanding that the corn's liquid is essential to the dish. Fast cooking methods and pre-cut ingredients have replaced the careful preparation that created authentic fried corn, leaving it as a memory of summer meals that few can properly recreate. 18. Syrup candy made from cane syrup. Cane syrup candy was a treat that mothers and grandmothers would make when pure cane syrup was available and children needed something special. The syrup would be boiled to the hard crack stage, testing doneness by dropping a bit into cold water to see if it formed brittle threads. Once ready, it would be poured onto buttered plates or marble slabs to cool, then broken into pieces or pulled while still pliable to create lighter, airier candy. The result was pure, intense sweetness with a complex flavor of cane sugar. Nothing like commercial candy. This was confection at its most basic and most satisfying. The candy-making process was a lesson in patience and temperature control. The syrup had to be watched constantly as it boiled, any distraction resulting in burning or incorrect consistency. Children would gather to watch, knowing they could lick the pot and utensils once the candy was poured. Some cooks would add butter to the boiling syrup for richness, others added vanilla or lemon. But the core was always pure cane syrup cooked to just the right stage. The candy would be wrapped in wax paper and stored in tins, rationed out as rewards for good behavior or shared with neighbors. Cane syrup candy has disappeared as access to real cane syrup has decreased and as homemade candy has been replaced by commercially produced sweets. The skill of cooking sugar to precise temperatures without a thermometer, knowing by instinct when it had reached the hard crack stage, has been lost. The tradition of making candy at home, of teaching children about patience and precision through candy making, has faded. What was once a regular treat, tied to harvest seasons and community sharing, has become a forgotten confection. 19. Monday red beans with ham bone. Red beans on Monday was not just tradition, it was practical necessity. After Sunday's ham dinner, the bone would be saved, still with meat clinging to it, to flavor a pot of red beans that would simmer all day Monday while women did laundry. The beans would cook slowly, absorbing the smoky ham flavor, breaking down until some dissolved into the cooking liquid to create a creamy consistency, while others remained whole, served over rice with a side of cornbread. This Monday meal required minimal attention while providing maximum flavor and nourishment. The beans themselves were usually dried red beans or kidney beans that had been soaked overnight. Monday morning, they would go into a pot with a ham bone, onions, celery, bell peppers, garlic, and bay leaves. Water would be added, and the pot would be set to simmer gently all day, stirred occasionally to prevent sticking. As the day progressed, the beans would soften, the ham would release its essence, and the broth would thicken. By evening, the beans would be perfectly creamy, seasoned throughout with smoky pork flavor, ready to be served over rice that would soak up the rich liquid. The Monday red beans tradition has faded as schedules have changed and as the practice of cooking Sunday ham has decreased. Slow cookers have partially replaced the day-long stovetop simmer, but they cannot replicate the texture achieved through traditional cooking. The use of a real ham bone with its gelatin and meat has been replaced by ham hocks or ham-flavored seasoning, changing the authentic taste. The ritual of planning meals across multiple days, of using leftovers intentionally to create new dishes, has given way to more immediate but less flavorful cooking approaches. 20. Bread pudding with whiskey sauce. Bread pudding in black households of the 1960s was not a planned dessert but a way to use stale bread that would otherwise be wasted. Leftover biscuits, cornbread, or sliced bread would be torn into chunks and soaked in a mixture of milk, eggs, sugar, and vanilla, then baked until set. The result was a humble pudding, crispy on top, custardy inside. That would be served warm with a sauce made from butter, sugar, and a generous splash of whiskey. This was comfort food that transformed scraps into something that felt luxurious, a dessert that spoke to resourcefulness and the refusal to waste. The preparation was flexible, adapting to whatever bread was available. Some cooks added raisins soaked in whiskey, others included pecans or coconut. The custard ratio was learned through experience. Too much liquid and the pudding would be soggy, too little and it would be dry. The whiskey sauce was crucial, made by melting butter with brown sugar, adding a little cream, and finishing with enough whiskey to make it complex without being boozy. Poured over warm bread pudding. This sauce elevated the dessert from frugal to fancy. Bread pudding persists in some forms, but the version made from genuine stale bread and served with real whiskey sauce has become rare. Most modern recipes use fresh bread, missing the texture that day-old biscuits or cornbread provided. The whiskey sauce has often been replaced with vanilla sauce or eliminated entirely, removing the adult sophistication that made the dessert special. The practice of cooking with leftovers, of making something delicious from what might have been thrown away, has been lost to an era of abundance where stale bread goes to the garbage rather than to the mixing bowl. 21. Fried green tomatoes with buttermilk dressing. Fried green tomatoes in the 1960s were not the trendy appetizer they have become, but a practical way to use tomatoes that would not ripen before frost. The firm green tomatoes would be sliced thick, dipped in seasoned cornmeal, and fried in hot fat until golden and crispy. The interior would remain slightly tart and juicy, contrasting beautifully with the crunchy coating. Served with a simple buttermilk dressing. Buttermilk mixed with mayonnaise, salt, pepper, and sometimes a touch of sugar. They were a side dish that balanced summer meals or provided a tangy counterpoint to rich meats. The technique required attention to coating and temperature. The cornmeal coating had to adhere properly, which meant the tomato slices might be dipped in egg or buttermilk first. The fat had to be hot enough to crisp the coating immediately without the tomatoes releasing too much moisture. The frying was quick, too long, and the tomatoes would become mushy. Too short, and the coating would not brown. The finished tomatoes needed to drain on paper or brown paper bags to shed excess fat while remaining crispy. While fried green tomatoes have experienced a revival, the authentic version with cornmeal coating and buttermilk dressing has been replaced by flour-coated versions served with fancy remoulades or aiolis. The straightforward preparation, the use of genuine buttermilk rather than cultured products, and the understanding that these were meant to be a practical use of end-of-season tomatoes rather than a gourmet dish has been lost. The simple buttermilk dressing, tangy and cooling, has been forgotten in favor of more complex sauces that obscure rather than complement. 22. Backbone and rice. Pork backbone, the spine of the hog with meat attached, slow cooked until tender and served over rice with Sunday dinner or a special weeknight meal. The backbone pieces would be seasoned heavily, browned in a pot, then simmered in liquid until the meat fell from the bones. The resulting dish was intensely flavorful, the rice soaking up the rich broth while the tender pork provided substance. This was not elegant food, but it was deeply satisfying, turning an inexpensive cut into something that could feed a family generously while tasting like you had spent far more than you actually did. The cooking process was slow and required understanding of tough cuts. The backbone needed hours of gentle heat to become tender. Rushing would result in chewy, disappointing meat. Some cooks added tomatoes to create a red gravy. Others kept it simple with just onions and seasoning. The rice would be cooked separately. Then the tender backbone pieces and their gravy would be served over it, everything soaking together on a plate. Children would pick the meat from the bones with their fingers, savoring every bit. Pork backbone has become nearly impossible to find in regular grocery stores, and even butchers rarely stock it. The willingness to deal with bony, awkward cuts has diminished, and the patience required to cook them properly competes poorly with quicker proteins. The technique of slow cooking tough, bony meats until tender has been largely abandoned in favor of boneless, quick cooking cuts. Backbone and rice has faded into memory, another dish that required both ingredient availability and cooking knowledge that has not been passed forward. 23. Tea cakes made with lard. Tea cakes were not delicate British confections, but substantial cookies made with lard, flour, sugar, and eggs, flavored simply with vanilla or nutmeg. They were called tea cakes because they were perfect for dunking in coffee or tea, sturdy enough not to dissolve, but tender enough to be pleasant. The lard gave them a distinctive texture, somewhere between cookie and cake, with a crumb that was dense but not heavy. Baked until just golden, with perhaps a sprinkle of sugar on top. These tea cakes were everyday treats, made in large batches and stored in tins to be eaten throughout the week. The recipe was simple, but relied on technique and quality ingredients. The lard needed to be creamed properly with the sugar to incorporate air, creating the right texture. The dough had to be rolled to the correct thickness, too thin, and the tea cakes would be crisp rather than tender, too thick, and they would be doughy. They were often cut with a glass or simple round cutter, placed on baking sheets, and baked just until set. Some cooks brushed them with milk before baking for shine. Others kept them plain. Tea cakes made with lard have disappeared as butter has replaced lard in most baking, and as commercially produced cookies have become ubiquitous. the distinctive texture that lard provided. Crisp edges with a tender center that was neither crispy cookie nor soft cake. Cannot be exactly replicated with butter. The practice of making large batches of simple cookies to have on hand, of baking regularly as part of household rhythm, has faded. The recipe variations that each family developed, the subtle differences that made everyone insist their grandmother's tea cakes were best, have been lost to standardization and convenience. 24. Pepper vinegar pickled vegetables. Pepper vinegar was a condiment found in nearly every black household, made by steeping hot peppers in vinegar until the liquid became infused with heat. This vinegar would then be used to pickle cucumbers, green beans, okra, and other garden vegetables, creating spicy, tangy preserves that would last through winter. The vegetables would be packed raw into jars with garlic, dill, and the pepper-infused vinegar would be poured over, hot, to seal and preserve. After curing for weeks, these pickles would be intensely flavored, crunchy, and fiery, perfect for cutting through rich foods or just eating straight from the jar. The making of pepper vinegar pickles was seasonal work, done when gardens were producing abundantly. Women would gather vegetables in the morning, process them during the day, and fill jars in assembly line fashion. The pepper vinegar itself was often maintained as a continuous culture. New vinegar and peppers added as the old was used. Each family's pepper vinegar had its own character, varying in heat level and flavor based on the peppers used and how long they had been steeping. The pickles made from this vinegar were distinctively different from store-bought versions, more complex and personal. Home pickling with pepper vinegar has largely disappeared as canning has become less common and as commercial pickles have become readily available and inexpensive. The maintenance of a pepper vinegar crock, continuously used and replenished, was a year-round commitment that fit a different pace of life. The knowledge of proper canning techniques, safe preservation methods, and ideal flavor combinations has not been fully transferred to younger generations. The taste of homemade pepper vinegar pickles, simultaneously hot, sour, and intensely vegetable forward, has become a memory rather than a present reality. 25. Peach cobbler with lard crust. Peach cobbler in the 1960s had a crust made with lard that achieved a flakiness butter could not match. Fresh peaches would be peeled, sliced, and sweetened, then topped with a lard-based crust that would bake until golden. As the cobbler cooked, the peach juices would bubble up around the crust, creating pockets where the pastry became syrup-soaked while other areas remained crispy. Served warm with a scoop of vanilla ice cream melting into the hot fruit, this was dessert at its most comforting, the taste of summer preserved in a pan. The crust-making technique was crucial. The lard had to be cold, cut into the flour with a pastry cutter or fingertips until the mixture resembled coarse crumbs. Ice water would be added sparingly, just enough to bring the dough together. Overworking would make it tough, underworking would make it fall apart. Some cooks made a bottom crust as well, others just a top, and a few made drop biscuit toppings instead. The peaches themselves had to be perfectly ripe, underripe, and they would be bland, overripe, and they would be mushy. The sugar amount was adjusted based on the peach's sweetness, a calculation made by taste and experience. Peach cobbler persists, but versions made with lard crusts have become extremely rare. Butter has replaced lard in most baking, changing the texture from impossibly flaky to merely good. The practice of making cobbler with fresh, seasonal peaches rather than canned fruit has diminished, and with it, the understanding that cobbler should taste primarily of fruit, with the crust playing a supporting role. The technique of making proper lard pastry, of achieving that perfect balance between flaky and tender, has not been widely passed down. What was once the standard for peach cobbler has become an increasingly distant memory.